Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a parking lot. Bloomfield Township, Michigan, July 30th, 1975. The temperature has climbed. The asphalt shimmers in the afternoon heat. A 1974 Pontiac Grandville sits parked near the entrance of the Mauchu's Red Fox restaurant, a polished, upscale establishment known for its award-winning cuisine and its wealthy suburban clientele. The man standing beside that car is 62 years old. He is stocky, his jaw is set hard. His eyes scan the lot with the kind of impatience that only belongs to a man who has never been made to wait in his life. His name is James Riddle Hoffa, the most powerful labor leader in American history. A man who once made presidents nervous and organized crime bosses call him first. And right now, in this sun-drenched parking lot, Jimmy Hoffa is waiting. He checks his watch. He walks to a payphone at the edge of the lot and dials home. His wife, Josephine, picks up. He tells her 2 men were supposed to meet him here. Neither one has shown. He says he'll be home by 4. He hangs up. That phone call is the last time anyone who loves Jimmy Hoffa will ever hear his voice. Somewhere between 2:45 and 2:50 that afternoon, a maroon Mercury Marquis pulls up to the lot. Witnesses later tell investigators they saw Hoffa approach the car. They saw him exchange words with the men inside. They saw him climb into the back seat. The car drives away. Jimmy Hoffa is never seen again. His body has never been found. Not then, not now, not ever. But to understand why Jimmy Hoffa got into that car, why he trusted the men who arranged that meeting, why the most feared union leader in America walked quietly to his death on a hot Wednesday afternoon in suburban Detroit, you have to go back, all the way back. Back to the beginning of the most secretive, most disciplined, most brutally effective criminal organization in American history. The Detroit Partnership, before we travel back through a century of shadows. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Tell me what time it is. I read every single one of your comments. Every one, and it means everything. If you're new here, welcome. You stumbled into a good one tonight. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, leave this video a like. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel more than you know. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because we're going to Detroit. And we're going back to 1910. In 1910, Detroit was a city on fire. Not literally, not yet. But the energy of the place, the noise, the ambition, the sheer roaring velocity of it felt combustible. Henry Ford had opened his Highland Park plant just a year earlier. The assembly line would follow in 1913. Between those 2 moments, the city transformed itself from a prosperous but ordinary Midwestern town into the industrial engine of the entire modern world. People poured in from everywhere. Poles and Hungarians came for the factories. African Americans came from the Deep South, fleeing sharecropping and Jim Crow, chasing the promise of northern wages, and from the sun-baked villages of Sicily and southern Italy. A wave of immigrants arrived carrying nothing but their names, their religion, and the complicated, unwritten codes of loyalty that had governed life in their homeland for centuries. Among them, in 1910, came 2 young men from Terracini, a small coastal village in the province of Palermo, Sicily, brothers-in-law, lifelong friends. Both barely out of boyhood, their names were Guglielmo Tocco and Giuseppe Zerilli. History would remember them as Black Bill and Joe. They did not arrive together on the same ship. They did not step off the gangplank holding hands. But they carried the same village, the same Sicilian blood, the same unspoken understanding of how the world worked, which was to say, how power worked and who had it and who did not. They settled on Detroit's east side. They worked laboring jobs. They kept their heads down and their eyes open. And they watched What they watched was extraordinary. Detroit in 1910 was a city where an immigrant with ambition had two paths available. The legal path was real but brutal. Factory floors that devoured men. 12-hour shifts, wages that kept you alive but never let you get ahead. The other path existed in the shadows. It was dangerous. It required violence, or at least the willingness to be near it. But it offered something the factory floor never could. It offered power, and in Terracini, Sicily, power was the only currency that mattered. Before Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco arrived, Detroit already had a criminal underworld. It was crude by the standards of what would come later, but it was functional and it was brutal. The earliest organized crime in Detroit was rooted in the Black Hand, a form of extortion practiced almost exclusively against Italian and Sicilian immigrants. The method was simple. A letter would arrive at the home or business of a prosperous Italian family. It would contain a drawing of a black handprint. It would demand money. It would promise that if the money was not paid, violence would follow. Sometimes the violence came first, as a demonstration. The Black Hand preyed on a community that was isolated, that didn't speak English. That distrusted American police as much as it had distrusted Sicilian authorities. And that had deep cultural prohibitions against speaking to law enforcement. In Sicily, the word for that prohibition had a name. Omerta, the code of silence. It traveled across the Atlantic, tucked inside the same suitcases as the saints, medallions and the dried herbs and the worn-out boots. And in Detroit's Italian neighborhoods, it took root just as firmly as it had in Palermo. The Black Hand gangs of early Detroit were eventually absorbed into or overrun by more sophisticated organizations. But they established something important. They proved that this community could be organized. They proved that the threat of violence, even more than actual violence, was a magnificent tool for controlling behavior. And they attracted men of a certain character. Men who understood the arithmetic of fear. Joe Zerilli was one of those men. He came to the attention of the city's underworld in the mid-1910s, working first as a laborer for the Detroit Gas Company while simultaneously orbiting the edges of various criminal enterprises. He was smart in a particular way that mattered. He didn't lead with his fists. He watched. He calculated. He built relationships slowly and tended them carefully. He had, from the very beginning, an unusual understanding of the long game. And then the most important economic event in Detroit's criminal history happened. Michigan went dry. In 1918, 2 full years before the rest of America, the state of Michigan passed its own prohibition on alcohol sales. The 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution followed in January 1919, making prohibition the law of the entire land for the Italian underworld of Detroit. This was not a disaster. It was a gold rush. Detroit's geography made it unique. The Detroit River, separating the United States from Windsor, Ontario, Canada, is barely half a mile wide at its narrowest point. On the American side, prohibition. On the Canadian side, functioning distilleries producing world-class whiskey, beer, and spirits in completely legal quantities. You could see the other shore with the naked eye. On a quiet night, you could practically smell the whiskey. The River Gang, led by brothers Thomas and Peter Licavoli, was among the first to understand the scale of the opportunity. They established smuggling routes across the river that operated with almost industrial efficiency, boats in summer and in the winter. When the river froze solid, something remarkable happened. Men drove cars across the ice, lightweight models they called Whiskey Sixes, smaller, 6-cylinder vehicles that could distribute their weight across the frozen surface without breaking through. They drove slowly, they drove carefully, and sometimes they drove their cars right to the bottom of the river because the ice gave way beneath them. But most of the time they made it. By 1929, Rum running was Detroit's second-largest industry, second only to automobile manufacturing. It generated an estimated $215 million per year, the equivalent of several billion dollars in today's money. The city had between 16,000 and 25,000 illegal speakeasies, those secret bars called blind pigs. Detroit had earned a nickname that nobody in city government was proud of, but that everybody who mattered knew was exactly right. Whiskey Town, and it is estimated that 4/5 of the entire country's contraband alcohol supply passed through Detroit. Let that sit for a moment. 4 out of every 5 illegal drinks in America coming through this one city, across this 1/2 mile of river, organized by a small collection of men who had figured out that geography was destiny. But before the big money could flow freely, there was blood to be spilled. Detroit's Italian underworld in the late 1910s was not a unified empire. It was a collection of competing factions, each controlling different neighborhoods, different rackets, and different streams of income. The 2 most powerful were the Genola gang, led by 3 brothers from Terracini named Gaetano, Antonio, and Salvatore, and the faction led by John Vitale. The Genola brothers had been in Detroit since around 1911. They started as grocers and fruit peddlers. Their grocery store was raided in late 1911 when police found $2,000 worth of stolen olive oil, a sign that even in those early years, their business practices were not entirely conventional. Over time, the Gianola organization grew into Detroit's dominant Italian crime group. Their ranks included men who would go on to reshape the entire city's underworld: Angelo Milli, William Tocco, Joseph Zerilli, and others. John Vitale had been aligned with the Gianolas, but in late 1918, he broke away and established himself independently. The reasons were personal. The reasons were financial. The reasons were the kind that men never fully explain, and that end in violence. What followed was the Gianola-Vitale War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in Detroit Mafia history. The Vitale faction struck first. Tony Gianola, the eldest brother and leader of the gang, was murdered in January 1919. His brother Sam took over. Vitale's men tried again in February, an attempt on Sam's life that failed. Though it killed Sam's brother-in-law Pasquale Diana in the process, Sam Gianola retaliated viciously. Through 1919 and into the early 1920s, bodies accumulated on both sides. The streets of Detroit's Italian neighborhoods smelled of gunpowder and grief. Wives became widows, children became orphans. Men learned to check beneath their cars each morning before turning the engine. Through all of this, the young Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco were not spectators. They were Gianola gunmen. They fought in this war. They survived when others did not, and in surviving, they learned lessons about violence that would shape everything that came after. Violence was a tool. Like any tool, it had to be used correctly. Use it carelessly, and it drew attention. It drew law enforcement. It destabilized everything and made money impossible to collect. Use it precisely, surgically, when necessary and only when necessary, and it consolidated power, established fear, and allowed business to continue undisturbed. This was not a moral lesson. It was a practical one. But it was a lesson that Joe Zerilli never forgot. The Gianola-Vitale War burned itself out eventually, the way such wars always do, not through peace agreements, but through exhaustion and mutual destruction. By the early 1920s, both factions had suffered enough that a period of consolidation became possible. The man who emerged to guide Detroit's Italian underworld through this consolidation was Salvatore Catalanot, known as the Gentle Dome. Catalanic preferred negotiation over bloodshed. He understood that constant violence was bad for business. It brought heat from the police and destabilized the flow of money. Under his leadership, the various Italian factions reached a fragile but functional peace that allowed the bootlegging empire to flourish. His approach would deeply influence the young Joe Zerilli, who watched and learned the value of restraint. Catalanet was a different kind of man. He was not naturally inclined toward bloodshed. He preferred diplomacy. He preferred negotiation. He had an ability to sit across from a man who might have every reason to hate him and find enough common ground to establish at least a temporary peace. His nickname, the Gentle Don, captured something real about his approach to leadership. Under Catalanet, Detroit's various Italian factions reached a kind of working equilibrium. The bootlegging money flowed, the peace held. The city's criminal world expanded without consuming itself. Alongside this Italian consolidation, another organization was rising simultaneously, and it was not Italian at all. They were the sons of Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. Their families had come to Detroit from the shtetls and cities of Eastern Europe, fleeing poverty and pogroms, and had settled in a neighborhood on the Lower East Side that locals called Little Jerusalem. It was bordered by Gratiot Avenue, Brush Street, Willis Avenue, and Russell Street, a dense, tight-knit community where poverty and ambition existed in equal measure. The boys who would become the Purple Gang grew up in those streets. They stole, they shoplifted, they ran numbers. They graduated from petty theft to armed robbery to organized criminal enterprise in the way that boys in poor neighborhoods often do, by following whoever seemed most powerful and most successful, and by proving their own toughness through acts of escalating violence. The story of how they got their name varies, depending on who tells it. The version most often repeated involves two shopkeepers on Hastings Street, whose stores had been repeatedly targeted by the boys. One shopkeeper said to the other, "These boys are not like other children of their age. They're tainted off color." The other replied, "Yes. They're rotten purple, like the color of bad meat. They're a purple gang." Whether or not that conversation actually happened, the name stuck, and by the 1920s, the Purple Gang was anything but bad meat. They were the most feared criminal organization in Detroit. Their genius, if you can call it that, was in understanding what business they were actually in. They were not primarily smugglers, they were hijackers. While other organizations took the risk of running liquor across the border from Canada, the Purples operated on the American side and simply waited for other smugglers to arrive. Then they stopped the trucks and automobiles at gunpoint, killed the drivers when convenient, and stripped the loads. They outsourced the dangerous border crossing to others and captured the inventory on arrival. It was brutal. It was efficient. It worked. The Purple Gang also had something that gave them enormous leverage with the broader national underworld. Al Capone needed their cooperation. Chicago's most famous gangster controlled what happened to alcohol once it left Detroit. But getting it out of Detroit required access to the Purple Gang's network. Rather than risk a war with these notoriously violent men, Capone made a deal. He bought from them. He cooperated with them. He kept the peace because the alternative was too expensive. The Purples also developed a relationship with Joe Zerilli, a complex arrangement that was part alliance, part competition, and always edged with mutual distrust. Zerilli, in his early days, actually worked alongside the Purple Gang, learning the business of bootlegging while building his own reputation within the Italian underworld. By 1929, Abe Bernstein, one of the founding brothers of the Purple Gang, worked closely with Meyer Lansky and Joe Adonis, connecting the Detroit operation to the national crime syndicate that was forming in New York. The Purples were at their peak, and at their peak, they made the mistake that has destroyed empires since before Rome fell. They started fighting each other. In 1931, a faction within the Purple Gang called the Little Jewish Navy grew ambitious. This group, which had specialized in rum running using boats on the river, decided they no longer needed the Purple Gang structure. 3 of their leaders, Jaime Paul, Joe Sutker, and Joe Lebowitz, began operating outside the territory assigned to them by the gang's leadership. The response from above was predictable. On September 16, 1931, the three men were invited to apartment 211 at 1740 Collingwood Avenue in Detroit. They were told it was a peace conference. It was not. After a brief discussion that settled nothing, the three unarmed men were shot to death by Purple Gang gunman Harry Keywell and Irving Milberg. On orders from Ray Bernstein, a man named Sol Levine had driven the three victims to the apartment. He survived either by design or accident, and he talked. The subsequent trial was highly public. Ray Bernstein, Harry Keywell, and Irving Milberg were convicted of first-degree murder. They received life sentences without parole. This moment, this one terrible afternoon in a Detroit apartment, broke the Purple Gang. By 1933, the Purples were no longer the dominant force in the city's underworld. Their leadership was in prison. Their ranks were scattered. Their empire was ripe for absorption. The Italian organization was ready to take what remained. And nobody was more ready than Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco. The years 1930 and 1931 were violent even by Detroit's generous standards. Following the death of Salvatore Catalanet in February 1930, who died of natural causes at the age of 36. Ironically, the temporary peace he had maintained began to unravel. What followed was called the Crosstown Mob Wars, a series of violent confrontations between different factions of Detroit's Italian underworld fighting over territory, rackets, and authority. The man who emerged from these wars as the most significant figure was not a single boss, but a coalition. Angelo Melli, a respected and feared figure from the Gianola era. William Black Bill Tocco, still connected to every important relationship in the city. Joseph Zerilli, now no longer a young unknown, but a man with a proven record of loyalty, intelligence, and survival. John Preziola, known as Papa John, from the Sicilian town of Partinico, and Peter Licavoli, whose river gang connections made him essential to any serious operation. These men formed a council. Detroit's underworld had seen councils before, temporary arrangements that dissolved when the strongest man decided he didn't need the others anymore. But this council was different. It was formalized by something larger than any individual in 1931. Lucky Luciano of New York convened a meeting that reorganized American organized crime on a national scale. The result was the Commission, a governing body for the Mafia that would arbitrate disputes between families, authorize major decisions, and create a framework stable enough for the business of crime to function across the entire country. The Commission initially consisted of 7 families, the 5 New York families, the Chicago outfit, and the Buffalo family. Detroit was not yet on it, but Detroit was recognized. And with that recognition came something precious: structure. The Detroit Partnership, as it came to be known within the American underworld, was formally established. It was modeled on the New York families, but adapted to Detroit's specific character. It had a boss, an underboss, a consigliere, and a series of capos who oversaw specific operations and territories. But what made the Detroit Partnership genuinely different from most other American Mafia families was not its structure. It was its discipline early in the partnership's existence. Zerilli and Tocco issued an edict that had no precedent in American organized crime. Members of the organization, made men and their associates, were required to marry the daughters, sisters, nieces, or cousins of other members. The policy was enforced rigorously. Young men rising through the ranks were quietly steered toward appropriate marriages. Daughters were encouraged, sometimes strongly, to marry within the extended network. The result was a web of blood and marital ties so dense that betrayal became almost suicidal. Informing on the organization didn't just risk your own life. it risked destroying the lives of your wife, your in-laws, your children's godparents, and multiple branches of your extended family. This single cultural innovation gave the Detroit partnership a level of internal security that other mafia families could only envy. For nearly 70 years, it produced only one cooperating made member. This was not a suggestion, it was a requirement. The logic was elegant and ruthless at once. If every man in the organization was connected to every other man by blood or marriage, then betrayal became almost cosmically complicated. Informing on the organization meant informing on your father-in-law, your brother-in-law, your wife's uncle, your cousin's husband. The web of relationships became so dense, so interwoven, that pulling on any single thread would collapse the entire fabric of a man's family life. Combined with the Sicilian tradition of omerta, the code of silence, this marriage requirement created an organization that was extraordinarily resistant to the one thing that destroyed most criminal enterprises: informants. In the entire history of the Detroit partnership, across nearly a century of operation, only one made member ever testified against the organization in open court. One. While other American Mafia families were being torn apart from within by a parade of cooperating witnesses, men who traded their loyalty for reduced sentences, the Detroit partnership remained. In the words of crime reporter Scott Bernstein, virtually free of turncoats, only one man broke. His name was Tocco, Joe Zerilli's own grandson. And that breach came in the year 2000, nearly 7 decades after the organization was founded. And even then, Tocco negotiated the terms of his testimony carefully. He would testify at his cousin Jack Tocco's sentencing hearing, but he refused to testify against his uncle Tony Zerilli, whom he considered a mentor. Even a man breaking the code insisted on maintaining parts of it. That is how deep the roots went. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. Prohibition was over. The great golden river of bootlegging money dried up almost overnight. For organizations less thoughtful than the Detroit Partnership, this was a catastrophe. Bootlegging had been their entire business model. Without it, they had nothing. But the Detroit Partnership had been preparing during the Prohibition years. Zerilli and the ruling council had been quietly diversifying. The gambling business, numbers running, betting parlors, horse race books had always existed alongside the liquor operations. As Prohibition ended, gambling became the primary engine. Detroit's numbers racket was particularly lucrative. It operated in African American neighborhoods through a system of runners and local operators. And it generated steady, predictable income that didn't require the dramatic logistics of rum running. Labor racketeering became another cornerstone. The auto industry had created an enormous unionized workforce, and the unions that organized that workforce were irresistible targets. Not by destroying the unions, no, the workers were a source of income and political influence. Not enemies, but by infiltrating the union leadership and directing the flow of union dues, pension funds, and contracts toward partnership-connected businesses. Loan sharking, providing high-interest loans to people who couldn't access conventional banking, expanded dramatically. The Depression of the 1930s had created an enormous population of desperate borrowers. The partnership was happy to lend. Extortion continued. Waste removal, trucking, construction, industries where the partnership could demand a percentage simply for allowing businesses to operate in their territory. And then, after World War II, something new, using its close connections to the Sicilian Mafia, connections that Joe Zerilli maintained carefully through his relationships with men in the old country. The Detroit Partnership became a major distributor of heroin in North America. This was controversial within the National Commission. Some bosses, Zerilli among them in his public posture, claimed to forbid narcotics. The money was too good. the liability too great. In practice, the partnership's involvement in heroin distribution was quietly acknowledged and quietly managed. It was another stream of income. It was controlled. It did not create the kind of street-level chaos that made headlines. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the Detroit Partnership's membership peaked at approximately 100 made men. Its annual revenue, at its height, would reach an estimated $150 million per year. Its legitimate business holdings, restaurants, real estate, construction companies, racing operations, gave it cover and respectability. The ruling council, Zerilli, Tocco, Melli, Prizziola, and Lee Cavalli, built large homes for themselves in Grosse Pointe Park, a wealthy suburb east of Detroit. They lived well, they lived quietly. They sent their children to the University of Detroit. They attended Mass. They sponsored charities. They were pillars of a community that did not look too closely at how the pillars were constructed. One of the most elegant and profitable ventures the partnership established in the post-prohibition era was its involvement in horse racing. Hazel Park Raceway opened in 1949 in Hazel Park, Michigan, just north of Detroit. The track was legally permitted and publicly operated. The partnership's interest in it was neither legal nor public. Through a web of front men, hidden ownership stakes, and control of concession operations, the partnership extracted money from the raceway at multiple levels. The concessions, food, beverages, programs were contracted to partnership-affiliated businesses. The betting operations, through which enormous sums of money flowed, were a natural extension of the gambling rackets the organization already ran throughout the city, and the races themselves could be influenced. The horse doping conviction of Jack Tocco in 1970, reported in both the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, offered a rare public glimpse into this particular operation. But for years before that, the raceway was a brilliant machine for generating laundered income. Money that entered as illegal gambling profit came out as legitimate concession revenue. It was accounting magic. It was the mob's version of financial engineering. Joe Zerilli was proud of it. It represented what he believed organized crime should look like: invisible, integrated into legitimate commerce, generating reliable profit without drawing the kind of attention that led to indictments. In 1956, something happened that cemented Joe Zerilli's status as one of the most respected crime bosses in America. Detroit was added to the commission. The commission, you will recall, had been established by Lucky Luciano in 1931 as a seven-family governing body for the American Mafia. For 25 years, Detroit had operated within the national syndicates framework, but without a formal seat at its decision-making table. In 1956, following a commission meeting, the Philadelphia family under Angelo Bruno and the Detroit family under Zerilli were both added. This was recognition of something that had been true for a long time. Detroit was not a secondary operation. It was not a provincial outpost. It was one of the most profitable, most well-run criminal enterprises in the country. And its boss was one of the most capable men in the national organization. Zerilli took his seat at the commission with the same quiet, measured dignity that characterized everything he did. He did not arrive demanding attention. He did not posture. He listened. He spoke when necessary. He built relationships. He particularly cultivated relationships with Carlo Gambino, who would become the most powerful figure in the New York Mafia through the 1960s and 70s, and with Frank Koslow, the so-called Prime Minister of the Underworld, whose approach to organized crime as a business rather than a battlefield resonated deeply with Zerilli's own philosophy. This was the world Joe Zerilli inhabited in the mid-1950s. This was the position from which he surveyed everything. And then one afternoon in November 1957, a state trooper named Edgar Crosswell looked out at the road near a farmhouse in upstate New York and saw cars arriving from all over the country with license plates from a dozen states. November 14th, 1957. 100 organized crime leaders from across the United States, Cuba, and Italy traveled to the home of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York, a small hamlet about 200 miles northwest of New York City, near the Pennsylvania border. Barbara's 53-acre estate was meant to provide discretion. Vito Genovese had called the meeting to legitimize his power after engineering the murder of Albert Anastasia and the removal of Frank Costello. He wanted every boss in the country to acknowledge his dominance. State Trooper Edgar Crosswell had been watching Barbara's property since the previous year, when he had noted a suspicious gathering of out-of-state vehicles, when expensive cars with plates from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and Florida began arriving again in November 1957. Crosswell recognized what he was looking at. He called for reinforcements. He set up roadblocks on the roads leading away from the property. When police began moving in, chaos erupted at the Barbara estate. Some of the most powerful criminals in America found themselves running through fields and woods in their expensive Italian suits, losing their shoes in the mud, scrambling through brush and briars trying to avoid arrest. Some were caught at the roadblocks, others were tracked down in the fields. Of approximately 100 attendees, 58 were arrested. The list of arrested men read like a who's who of American organized crime: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Bonanno, Paul Castellano, and dozens of others. Joe Zerilli was not among them, according to one account that became widely circulated. Zerilli had been on his way to Appalachian with his driver Anthony Giacalone, the young man who would later become the partnership's most important street boss. Giacalone heard on the car radio that police had raided the Barbara estate. He turned the car around, just like that. The FBI had airport and hotel records, placing Zerilli in New York around the time of the meeting. But without an arrest at the scene, without a witness placing him inside the estate, there was nothing to charge him with. Joe Zerilli was not on the list. He was not arrested. He was not photographed running through mud in a $1,000 suit. His name did not appear in the newspapers the next morning. His discipline, his caution, his habit of never being exactly where the danger was, it had saved him again. But Appalachian changed everything. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly maintained that a national organized crime syndicate did not exist. He had diverted FBI resources away from the mob and toward communists, labor agitators, and civil rights leaders, threats he considered more real or more politically convenient. But with 58 senior criminals from across the country arrested at a national meeting, Hoover's position was untenable. He was forced to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The Mafia was real. The Commission was real. The National Syndicate was real. Hoover created the Top Hoodlum Program, a dedicated FBI effort to investigate organized crime at the highest levels. He assembled task forces. He authorized resources. He pointed his enormous federal apparatus directly at the families that had operated in comfortable obscurity for decades. The age of invulnerability was over, and in the years that followed, Joe Zerilli would need every ounce of his famous caution to keep the Detroit partnership standing. To understand Jimmy Hoffa, you have to understand the Teamsters. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters was founded in 1903 as a union for horse-drawn wagon drivers, the Teamsters, who moved goods through city streets. As the 20th century progressed and horses gave way to trucks, the Teamsters became the union for America's truck drivers. And truck drivers were the circulatory system of the American economy. Every product manufactured, every piece of food, every component part of every machine, all of it moved on trucks. All of it moved because Teamsters drove those trucks, control the Teamsters. And you had leverage over the entire American economy. Jimmy Hoffa understood this more clearly than anyone. He was born in 1913 in Brazil. Indiana. His father died when he was 7. His family moved to Detroit. He dropped out of school and went to work in a warehouse at 14. By 19, he was leading a strike. By his mid-20s, he was a rising power in the Michigan Teamsters. By 1957, the same year as the Appalachian disaster, he was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. At its peak under Hoffa's leadership, the Teamsters had more than 2 million members. It was the largest union in the United States. Its Central States Pension Fund, the retirement fund for hundreds of thousands of truck drivers, accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars under Hoffa's management. Hoffa was not subtle about his relationship with organized crime. He cultivated it deliberately. He understood that the Mafia controlled crucial aspects of the transportation industry, loading docks, warehouses, certain trucking companies, and that working with the mob was more efficient than fighting them. "The mob is a business," he reportedly said. "I do business with businessmen." But as investigative reporter Don Moldea later put it, the mob didn't do business with Hoffa. The mob owned Hoffa, lock, stock, and barrel. They just hadn't told him. The Detroit Partnership's relationship with Hoffa was managed primarily through Anthony Giacalone, the young man who had turned the car around before Appalachian, who had grown from Joe Zerilli's pickup, man in the numbers racket, to one of the most powerful figures in Detroit organized crime. Tony Jack, as he was known, was Hoffa's handler. He was the man who sat between the world of the Teamsters and the world of the partnership, managing the relationship and ensuring that it remained productive for both sides. They were friendly, they had dinner together. Their families knew each other. When Hoffa had a problem with someone in the underworld, he called Tony Jack. When the partnership needed something from the Teamsters, Tony Jack made the call. The Teamsters Pension Fund was the key instrument. The Central States Pension Fund, managed by Hoffa and his associates, became what the FBI would later describe as the most abused, misused pension fund in America under Hoffa's direction. The fund made loans to businesses and individuals with organized crime connections. The mob needed capital to expand into Las Vegas. The pension fund provided it. The mob needed to build hotels and casinos in Nevada. The pension fund lent the money. In 1949, Hoffa met Paul Dorfman, the head of the Chicago Waste Handlers Union and a key figure in the Chicago outfit, and struck a deal that introduced him to Alan Dorfman, Paul's stepson. Alan Dorfman became the administrator of the Teamsters Pension Fund's insurance business over time. Dorfman would facilitate loans to organized crime-connected casinos in Las Vegas that totaled hundreds of millions of dollars. Caesar's Palace, which opened in August 1966 with a $50 million Teamsters loan. The Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, the Marina, all built or expanded with money that belonged to truck drivers who were counting on it for their retirements. The high water mark for pension fund investment in Las Vegas came in 1976, with $272, $3 million in loans, $249, $4 million of which went directly into casinos, and from those casinos, money flowed back out in ways that never appeared on any balance sheet. In Las Vegas, the mob didn't just own casinos. They owned the cash that moved through those casinos before it was ever counted. The skim, it worked like this. Counting rooms in mob-controlled casinos were not sealed environments with strict oversight. They were environments where trusted men, mob associates, and their employees could remove cash from the counting tables before it was officially recorded. Money that was never recorded never existed. Money that never existed could never be taxed. And money that was never taxed could flow directly into the pockets of mob bosses in Detroit, Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. The cash traveled in paper bags, sometimes in suitcases. Couriers moved it across state lines. It arrived at the homes and offices of mob leaders as pure, untraceable profit. Detroit's connection to Las Vegas ran through several channels. The Aladdin Hotel and Casino, in particular, had ties to the Detroit partnership. Anthony Zerilli, Joe Zerilli's son, was later charged and convicted for skimming millions from a Las Vegas hotel and casino. That conviction in 1973 cost him his expected succession as Detroit's next boss. His father demoted him after the conviction. Unable to have a man under that kind of federal scrutiny in the leadership position, Jack Tocco, Zerilli's nephew, would later face his own federal investigation tied to the Aladdin Hotel's connection to the Detroit family through convicted bank robber James Tamer, who was operating the establishment, Las Vegas. In the 1960s and 1970s, was the mob's greatest prize and greatest vulnerability? The money was extraordinary. But the money required such elaborate mechanisms of concealment and distribution that every person who touched it became a potential witness, a potential informant, a potential unraveling thread. The partnership, true to form, tried to keep its Las Vegas involvement quieter than its peers. But quiet wasn't possible forever. Not with the kind of money involved. Robert Kennedy hated Jimmy Hoffa. The feeling was mutual, and it was fierce. These were two of the most intense, most combative personalities of mid-century America, and they found in each other the perfect adversary. Kennedy first encountered Hoffa during the Senate Labor Management Rackets Committee hearings of the late 1950s, the McClellan Committee, chaired by Senator John McClellan of Arkansas. Kennedy served as the committee's chief counsel. The hearings were televised. The country watched. And what the country watched was remarkable. It watched a stocky, pugnacious union boss sit across from a slim, intense Senate lawyer and refuse to give an inch when Kennedy asked questions. Hoffa deflected. When Kennedy pressed, Hoffa pushed back. When Kennedy used the phrase, "I don't recall," mockingly noting that Hoffa himself used it constantly as a legal shield, Hoffa smiled and used it again. The antagonism was personal, and it was permanent. When John Kennedy won the presidency in 1960 and appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General, Hoffa understood that his comfortable arrangement with federal authorities was over. The new Attorney General assembled what became known internally as the Get Hoffa Squad, a team of investigators and prosecutors whose sole purpose was to build a case against the Teamsters president. Bobby Kennedy knew the mob couldn't operate Las Vegas without the Teamsters. He knew Hoffa's pension fund was the mob's bank, and he knew that if he could take Hoffa down, he could starve the mob of the capital it needed to sustain itself. Hoffa's legal battles consumed the first half of the 1960s. He was charged with accepting improper payments from a trucking company. He was acquitted. He was charged with misusing the pension fund. He went to trial. He was charged with jury tampering in connection with that trial. He was convicted in 1964, sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. In 1967, with his appeals exhausted, Jimmy Hoffa walked into the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He would be back. He was certain of it. What he didn't know was what would be waiting for him when he returned. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968. The Teamsters were one of his most important constituencies. The union had endorsed him. The mob-connected men who controlled the union's political operation had delivered support that Nixon valued. In December 1971, Nixon pardoned Jimmy Hoffa, but the pardon came with a condition that Nixon's Justice Department attached. Hoffa was prohibited from participating in direct or indirect union activities until March 1980. The condition was unusual. Conditions attached to presidential pardons were rare, and Hoffa was furious. He believed, and he was probably right, that the condition had been arranged by Frank Fitzsimmons. who had taken over as Teamsters president while Hoffa was in prison and had no intention of handing power back. Fitzsimmons, unlike Hoffa, was a comfortable and compliant figurehead for the mob. He didn't push back. He didn't make demands. He signed what he was told to sign and approved what he was told to approve. The mob, in particular the Detroit Partnership's faction and allied families, found Fitzsimmons infinitely preferable to the intense, controlling, perpetually ambitious Hoffa. Hoffa didn't care. He began fighting to have the pardon condition overturned. He filed lawsuits. He campaigned among rank-and-file Teamsters. He reached out to local presidents across the country, reminding them of what he had built and what he intended to reclaim. He made speeches. He gave interviews. He told his family and friends, "I'm coming back." His family begged him not to. His son, James P. Hoffa, who would eventually become Teamsters president himself, told his father the risks were too great. His wife, Josephine, knew something was wrong, the way wives always know before their husbands admit it to themselves. But Hoffa's entire identity was bound up in the Teamsters. Without the union, without the power, without the daily sense of commanding the most important labor organization in the world, who was Jimmy Hoffa? He was just a 62-year-old ex-convict from Detroit with a limited education and a lot of enemies. He couldn't accept that, and his inability to accept it was the last mistake he ever made. Wednesday, July 30th, 1975. Jimmy Hoffa kissed his wife Josephine goodbye at the kitchen door of their summer cottage on Lake Orion, Michigan. Sometime around 1 p.m., he got into his car and drove. He made a stop in Pontiac to visit a friend, and he drove south toward Bloomfield Township and the Machu's Red Fox restaurant, which had been opened by restaurateur Harris Machu's in 1965 and had earned a reputation as one of Metro Detroit's finest dining establishments. His datebook noted a meeting with Tony G., Tony P., and Lenny S. Tony G. was Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, his longtime handler, the man who had introduced him to the mob's world decades ago, the man he trusted. Tony P. was Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a powerful New Jersey Teamsters official and a capo in the Genovese crime family, a man with whom Hoffa had a bitter personal feud going back to their days in Lewisburg prison together. Tony Pro had been convicted in 1966 of extortion from his own union. Their relationship had curdled into something toxic, but Hoffa needed Tony Pro's support to win the Teamsters presidency back. So he swallowed his pride and agreed to meet. Hoffa arrived at the Red Fox at approximately 2 p.m. On a day when the temperature had climbed to 91 degrees, he waited some more. He went to a payphone at the edge of the parking lot. This was 1975. There were no cell phones, and called Josephine. He told her neither man had shown up. He said he'd be home by 4. The FBI later determined that Tony Giacalone had spent the entire afternoon of July 30th at the Southfield Athletic Club, less than 5 miles from the Red Fox, establishing an airtight alibi. He and Leonard Schultz didn't leave each other's side. They were loudly, obviously present in a location that was not the Red Fox restaurant. Tony Provenzano was in New Jersey. Neither man had ever intended to come. Between 2:45 and 2:50 p.m., a maroon Mercury Marquis pulled into the Red Fox parking lot. The car was registered to Joey Giacalone, Tony Jack's son. Witnesses saw Hoffa approach the car. They saw him speaking with the men inside. They saw him climb into the back seat. The car left. Jimmy Hoffa left with it. He was never seen again. The FBI's later investigation revealed that the maroon Mercury Marquis was registered to Joey Giacalone, son of Tony Jack. Witnesses described Hoffa getting into the back seat willingly. He trusted the name. He trusted the arrangement. What he didn't know, or perhaps refused to accept, was that the meeting had been a carefully orchestrated lure. Federal investigators believe he was driven to a nearby house, where he was killed quickly and efficiently. His body was never found. One of the most complete disappearances in modern American criminal history. The case remains officially open more than 50 years later. The FBI found his 1974 Pontiac abandoned in the restaurant parking lot the next day. Inside it, under the right front seat, investigators found a 7-Up bottle. On that bottle were the fingerprints of Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, a man who had grown up as an informal foster son of Hoffa's, and who was, by 1975, deeply embedded in the Detroit mob's operations. On September 2, 1975, FBI agents searched a house owned by a Giacalone associate in the Detroit suburb of Bloomfield Hills. They found traces of blood in the kitchen. The theories multiplied. The investigation went on for years. Decades. It continues to this day. The most credible account, assembled from FBI files, informant testimony, and the work of investigative journalists, suggests that Hoffa was lured into the Mercury Marquis by Vito "Billy Jack" Giacalone, Tony Giacalone's brother, once in the car, with Anthony Palazzolo, a rising Detroit mob soldier known as Tony Powell, also present. Hoffa was told the real meeting was happening elsewhere, at a location where he would feel comfortable. He trusted the Giacalone name. He went. Tony Powell Palazzolo later bragged about his role in the Hoffa killing on an FBI wire in the 1990s. An FBI informant in 2012 told agents that Palazzolo had beaten and strangled Hoffa to death. The feds who work the case today largely believe this account. The orders, federal investigators believe, came from the top, from Jack Tocco and Tony Giacalone, acting on instructions from the aging Joe Zerilli, who had decided or had been persuaded by the commission that Jimmy Hoffa's campaign to retake the Teamsters presidency was too dangerous to allow. Fitzsimmons was manageable, a resurgent Hoffa, angry and desperate and willing to expose his mob connections to get his power back, was a catastrophe waiting to happen. So they ended him. And they disappeared him so completely that 50 years later, in 2025 and 2026, as you are watching this, the FBI is still taking tips. Still looking. Jimmy Hoffa has never been found. His remains are one of the great mysteries of American criminal history. He was declared legally dead on July 30th, 1982, 7 years to the day after he vanished. The Hoffa disappearance did not end the investigation. It ignited it. The FBI poured enormous resources into the case. Tony Giacalone was convicted in 1976 of tax evasion and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Tony Provenzano was convicted in 1978 of the murder of a different man, Teamsters official Anthony Castellito, and sentenced to life in prison. He died there in 1988. Tony Giacalone never went to prison for Hoffa. He died in 2002 at the age of 82. Having spent his final years fighting cancer and federal investigators in about equal measure, never cracking, never confessing, never providing the one piece of testimony that might have closed the case. Chucky O'Brien, whose fingerprints were on the 7-Up bottle, maintained his innocence until his death. He admitted being in the car that day, the Mercury Marquis, but claimed he had been there to deliver a gift, not to transport Hoffa to his death. The partnership's code of silence held. Even in the Hoffa case, possibly the most investigated murder in American history, the men who knew said nothing. One man was dead. 50 years of investigation produced no conviction, no body. Nothing except theories and FBI files in a parking lot in Bloomfield Township where, in the place of the Machu's Red Fox, there now stands a chain Italian restaurant called Andiamo. The irony of that is so thick you could choke on it. Before we move into the 1970s and 1980s, we need to understand the federal pressure that had been building for decades. pressure that would eventually crack even the Detroit Partnership's famous composure. The Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950 and 1951 were the first nationally televised congressional investigation of organized crime. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee chaired the committee. For the first time, millions of Americans sat in front of their television sets and watched mob figures invoke their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, again and again, refusing to answer questions about gambling, murder, and corruption. The hearings named names. Detroit names: the Jackalone brothers, Black Bill Tocco, Joe Zerilli. In 1963, Joseph Valaki, a soldier in the Genovese family who agreed to testify before the Senate, provided the government with the first detailed insider account of how the American Mafia was organized. He used the term La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours, and described the commission, the initiation rituals, the ranks, the codes. His testimony mentioned Joe Zerilli's name multiple times. But testimony without corroboration was not enough to convict. The Detroit Partnership moved carefully in the aftermath of Valachi's revelations. It adjusted, it adapted, it continued. The 1970 passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO Act, was a different matter entirely. RICO was not designed to prosecute individual crimes. It was designed to prosecute criminal organizations. Under RICO, a prosecutor could charge an entire organization with a pattern of racketeering and use crimes committed by individual members as evidence of that pattern. For the first time, a boss who hadn't personally pulled a trigger or personally collected a loan shark payment could be charged based on his position in the organization that committed those acts. RICO was the weapon the government had been searching for, and Detroit was in its crosshairs. On October 30th, 1977, Joseph Zerilli died of natural causes at his home in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. He was 80 years old. He died in his bed. This was extraordinary. This was for a man who had led a violent criminal organization for more than 4 decades. Essentially a miracle. He had outlasted rivals, survived wars, navigated federal investigations, avoided arrest at Appalachian, maintained silence through Valachi and Kefauver, and everything else the government threw at the American Mafia. He was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Detroit. Joe Zerilli took the secret of Jimmy Hoffa's murder to his grave. Whatever he knew, whatever he had ordered or authorized, went with him into the ground. The partnership was left to Zerilli's trusted men. Papa John Preziola, the last surviving member of the original ruling council, 86 years old and representing the original partnership's inception in 1931, briefly tried to manage the family's affairs after Zerilli's death. But Preziola was ancient, and his tenure was brief. He died in April 1979, 2 years after Zerilli, with his death. The system of leadership that dated back to Prohibition ended. The future of the Detroit Partnership now belonged to Giacomo Jack Tocco. Jack Tocco was born around 1926, the son of Vito William Tocco, nephew of the great Black Bill and Rosalie Zerilli, Joe Zerilli's sister. By blood, he connected both of the partnership's founding dynasties. He was the living embodiment of the intermarriage policy that Zerilli and Black Bill had established 4 decades earlier. He had grown up in the upscale Windmill Point section of Grosse Pointe Park, in one of those large houses the ruling council had built for themselves. In 1949, the same year that Tony Zerilli also received a degree, Jack Tocco graduated from the University of Detroit with a degree in finance. Congressional testimony later suggested that around this time, both young men made their bones and were inducted into the Mafia. Jack Tocco inherited the partnership at a difficult moment. Several key members were facing prison or under active investigation. The Hoffa case had brought enormous federal attention to the organization. Tony Zerilli, Zerilli's son and heir apparent, had been imprisoned in 1973 on Las Vegas skimming charges and was excluded from the top position as a result. But Tocco had qualities that the moment required. He was quiet. He was disciplined. He was, if anything, even more averse to public exposure than the old Don himself. He cultivated legitimate business holdings, real estate development, horse racing interests, other investments, with genuine acumen. He and his brother Tony purchased and developed a 32-acre property in Oakland Township that eventually generated several $1 million in profit through a housing development. He maintained what the partnership had always maintained best: silence. The FBI's induction ceremony surveillance was the one genuinely embarrassing moment in 1979. The FBI managed to capture on camera the ceremony at which Jack Tocco was officially confirmed as boss of the Detroit partnership. It was a rare glimpse into a world that went to enormous lengths to remain invisible. But a surveillance camera at an induction ceremony was not a conviction. And conviction was what the government needed. Through the early 1980s, Tocco navigated the continuing federal pressure by doing what his predecessors had done. He kept his head down. He maintained discipline. He kept violence at a minimum. The partnership's long-standing policy was that violence should be an absolute last resort, used only when all other options were exhausted. The organization that had once held 100 made men was smaller now, but it was still functioning. It was still profitable. The gambling operations, bookmaking, loan sharking, sports betting continued. The labor racketeering, diminished from its peak, but never entirely eliminated, continued. The legitimate businesses generated income and cover, and then the world changed around them. Detroit in the 1980s was not the city that Joe Zerilli had come to in 1910. The industrial giant was crumbling. The 1973 oil crisis had devastated the American auto industry by creating sudden, enormous demand for fuel-efficient cars that Detroit's manufacturers were utterly unprepared to produce. Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, Datsun, moved aggressively into the American market with smaller, more efficient vehicles. Detroit's market share began to erode. Factories closed. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off. Neighborhoods that had hummed with working-class prosperity became zones of unemployment, poverty, and desperation. The tax base collapsed. City services deteriorated. And into this deteriorating city came crack cocaine. The crack epidemic hit Detroit with particular ferocity in the mid-1980s. Street gangs that had nothing to do with the old Italian Mafia structure exploded across the city, controlling corners and neighborhoods through a combination of extreme violence and the massive profits available in retail drug distribution. The Chambers Brothers, Young Boys Incorporated, Best Friends. These street organizations were nothing like the partnership. They had no generational discipline, no code of silence, no long-term institutional memory. What they had was ruthlessness and a product that destroyed everything it touched. And they were willing to use violence on a scale and with a frequency that the partnership, in its careful, disciplined approach to public order, had never contemplated. Detroit's murder rate climbed to levels that made it the homicide capital of the United States. In some years, the city recorded more than 700 murders in a single year. This in a city with a declining population that fell from nearly 1.9 million in 1950 to below 700,000 by 2010. The Italian mob's position in this environment was awkward. The partnership had always maintained its power, partly through control of the streets, not through direct presence, but through relationships with local operators who understood that certain lines should not be crossed. The explosion of street gang activity rewrote those relationships entirely. Young men with no knowledge of or respect for the old arrangements were not going to defer to aging Italian men in Grosse Pointe. The partnership's membership was aging. The old-maid men who had built the organization were dying or imprisoned. The generation coming up behind them was smaller, less experienced, and operating in an environment where the federal government was more determined than ever to put them away. Through the 1980s, the FBI pursued the American Mafia with more resources and sophistication than ever before in the Bureau's history. In New York, the famous commission trial of 1986 put the bosses of all 5 New York families behind bars using RICO. The Mafia Commission, the governing body that Lucky Luciano had created in 1931, was effectively destroyed as an active organization. In Detroit, the FBI's investigation built slowly. The technique that proved most effective was not informants. The partnership's famous loyalty had largely held against that, but electronic surveillance, wiretaps and bugs, hidden microphones in social clubs, in automobiles, in businesses, men talking on the phone in what they believed was privacy, not knowing that federal agents were recording every word. The Detroit FBI field office launched a series of operations through the 1980s and into the 1990s that systematically documented the partnership's gambling operations, its loan sharking, and its extortion of bookmakers and other gambling-adjacent businesses. The evidence accumulated slowly, case by case, recording by recording, and meanwhile, within the partnership itself, the strains were beginning to show. Tony Zerilli, freed from prison after his Las Vegas conviction, found himself in fresh legal trouble when he was recorded by an FBI informant bragging about his activities. This triggered a federal investigation into the Detroit family's interests in the Aladdin Hotel and Casino, which was being operated by convicted bank robber James Tamer. Tony Zerilli was indicted again. His legal troubles became a recurring feature of the 1980s and early 1990s. Vito Giacolone, Tony Jack's brother and Hoffa, suspect and underworld figure in his own right, faced his own federal investigations. Tony Giacolone himself, despite spending his last years fighting cancer, remained a target of active federal scrutiny until his death in 2001. The men who had built the partnership's golden age were dying in prison or dying of natural causes. Whichever came first, the generation replacing them was thinner, more cautious, less powerful, but still. Jack Tocco endured. The operation had a name. Operation Gamutex. It was 1996. Jack Tocco had been running the Detroit partnership for nearly 2 decades. He had maintained the organization's traditions, secrecy, discipline, diversification, silence. He had kept violence at a minimum, never drawing the kind of attention that had destroyed other families. He had built a real estate portfolio that would have made a legitimate businessman proud. But the FBI had been listening for years. With patience that matched the partnership's own, in 1996, federal agents arrested Jack Tocco and the entire senior administration of the Detroit partnership. The indictment, minus 25 counts of racketeering, charged them with a pattern of criminal activity that included bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion. It was Operation Gamutex, and it named virtually every significant figure in the organization's current leadership. Charged alongside Tocco were Anthony Corrado, Vito Giacolone, Tony Zerilli, who once again found himself in federal court, and others. The indictment characterized them as the leaders of the Detroit branch of the national La Cosa Nostra organization. The trial was long and contentious. Prosecutors arranged a critical deal. Nove Tocco, Jack Tocco's own cousin and Joe Zerilli's grandson, agreed to testify against the boss. He was the first member of the Detroit partnership to turn state's evidence since the family's founding in 1921. Nearly 7 decades of perfect silence. And then it broke, not with a flood, with one man, one deal. Nove Tocco's testimony was complicated by the fact that he admitted he had never received direct orders from Jack Tocco, allowing him to engage in the extortion activities that had initially gotten him into trouble. He was compelled to admit that his own misconduct had been the source of his problems. But his testimony about the organization's structure and operations was damaging enough. On November 13, 1998, Judge John Corbett O'Meara sentenced Jack Tocco to a year or less in a halfway house, a sentence that prosecutors immediately challenged as far too lenient for the kingpin of a continuing criminal enterprise. Prosecutors demanded prison time. On December 23, 1998, Tocco was resentenced to 1 year at the Federal Medical Facility in Rochester, Minnesota. He served barely 2 years behind bars in total. During sentencing, Tocco was supported by an array of community figures that illustrated just how deeply embedded the partnership had been in legitimate Detroit society. Former Detroit Tigers manager Sparky Anderson wrote on his behalf. A former mayor, political fundraisers, restaurant owners, retired judges, doctors, lawyers, priests, Jack Tocco was not. In the eyes of much of Detroit's establishment, a monster. He was a respected businessman who happened to have some uncomfortable associations. The mob's genius, its greatest achievement over 9 decades, was exactly this, making itself so integral to the fabric of legitimate society that the line between the criminal and the respectable became genuinely impossible to see. Tony Zerilli and Tony Giacalone, both ill, extended their trials indefinitely. They were never convicted in the Gamutex case. The federal government declared, with characteristic overstatement, that it had driven a stake through the heart of the Detroit Mafia. As usual, this was premature. When Jack Tocco was released from federal custody in 2002, the FBI made a quiet note in its operational files. Tocco had resumed his position as boss of the Detroit Partnership, the organization that federal authorities had declared dead after the 1998 convictions had continued operating with little to no interruption during Tocco's imprisonment. This was by design. Joe Zerilli had planned it that way. Decades earlier, by requiring intermarriage, by creating a structure so deeply embedded in family relationships that it had no clear external boundary. He had built an organization that could survive the removal of any individual, even its boss, sons, nephews, and cousins who had been employed in the family business for their entire adult lives continued what they had always done. The bookmaking operations continued. The loan sharking continued. The extortion of gambling-adjacent businesses continued. The machinery kept running because the machinery was made of people, and the people were made of a culture and a set of relationships that no federal indictment could touch. A new generation was taking shape. Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, Anthony Giacalone's brother, Jimmy Hoffa's suspected actual abductor, underboss of the partnership, retired from active involvement in mob affairs in his later years. He died in 2012. His son Jack V. Giacalone, known as Jackie the Kid, and also, improbably, as Jackie the Bathrobe, had been rising through the partnership's ranks for years. Jackie Giacalone served as a capo from 1990. He looked after gambling operations. He became a lieutenant to Jack Tocco. He was, according to law enforcement sources, being groomed to be a future Don. The nickname Jackie the Bathrobe came from surveillance, photographs that showed him regularly conducting business while wearing a bathrobe. It was the kind of detail that made federal agents smile and write memos and feel like they were watching a character from a movie. Jackie apparently disliked the nickname Jackie the Kid even more. It had been given to him by his uncle Tony Jack Giacalone, who derived it from Jackie's fondness for Western films and his particular interest in the legend of Billy the Kid. This detail, a Detroit mob enforcer being nicknamed after a 19th century Western gunfighter by his uncle because of his love of cowboy movies, contains. Somehow, Everything you need to know about the strange, human, almost mundane reality of organized crime. Peter Tocco, grandson of Black Bill Tocco, nephew of Jack Tocco, became another significant figure in the partnership's post-Gamutex operations. In 2006, the FBI arrested more than a dozen individuals in Detroit on RICO charges of bookmaking, money laundering, and extortion. Peter Tocco was among the alleged ringleaders. Referred to on surveillance tapes as Blackie and Specs, he pleaded guilty and served a 2-year sentence. Jack Giacalone went to trial in that same case. He was acquitted. The partnership survived again. On July 14, 2014, Giacomo Jack Tocco died. Tocco had led the partnership longer than any previous boss. He navigated RICO prosecutions, aging membership, the collapse of Detroit's industrial base, and the rise of street gangs with the same low-profile discipline his predecessors had practiced. At his funeral, the line between the legitimate and underworld worlds blurred once again. As community leaders, businessmen, and old associates paid their respects to a man many still viewed simply as a successful, quiet Detroiter, he was 87 years old. He died in his home in the Detroit suburb of Grosse Pointe. He had led the Detroit partnership for more than 3 decades. He had survived federal indictments, prison, the dismantling of mafia families across the country, the death of allies and enemies alike, and the dramatic transformation of Detroit itself from industrial giant to bankrupt city. Through all of it, Jack Tocco had maintained his composure, his discipline, his silence. His father had built the organization alongside Joe Zerilli. His uncle's wife was Zerilli's sister. He had grown up in the shadow of men who had made the crossing from Sicily with nothing and built a criminal empire that lasted nearly a century in America. And he had extended that empire into the 21st century, against odds that would have destroyed lesser organizations. At his funeral, there were people from all the worlds Jack Tocco had inhabited, the legitimate world, businessmen, lawyers, community figures, and the other world, represented by men whose presence required no identification for those who knew what to look for. The Detroit Free Press ran an obituary. The federal government made no public statement. In July 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The city had accumulated more than $18 billion in long-term debt and unfunded pension obligations. Its population had collapsed from nearly 2 million at mid-century to well under 700,000. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned. Homes worth $100,000 in 1970 sold for $1, literally $1. In the 2000s, street lights didn't work. Police response times stretched to hours in some areas. The city that had made the 20th century, that had built the cars, created the assembly line, produced the music of Motown, and sustained the dreams of millions of immigrants, had broken. And in breaking, it had taken something of the partnership with it. The organization's power had always been rooted in this city, in its neighborhoods, in its labor unions, in its businesses and its gambling operations, and its culture of mutual obligation and carefully maintained omerta. As the city's economy contracted, as neighborhoods emptied, as the institutions that had sustained both legitimate and criminal enterprise hollowed out, the partnership's resources contracted with them. The Detroit mob in the 2010s was not what the Detroit mob had been in the 1960s. It was smaller. It was older. It had fewer made men, fewer associates, less money, and less reach. Its connections to the National Commission, that governing body Lucky, Luciano had created in 1931, were largely historical artifacts. But it was not gone. Law enforcement sources in Michigan consistently noted, through the 2000s and into the 2010s, that the partnership remained operational. Diminished, reduced, but operational, The bookmaking continued. The loan sharking continued. The old networks, maintained by men who had grown up in this culture and knew no other, kept functioning because they had always functioned, because they were built of relationships and habits and obligations that outlasted any single generation. Before we reach the end, we should return for a moment to where we began, the Purple Gang. After the Collingwood Manor massacre of 1931 broke their power, after the convictions that sent their leaders to prison, after the Italian partnership absorbed their remaining operations, what happened to the Purples? Abe Bernstein, one of the founding brothers, negotiated the most remarkable exit in gangster history. He made a deal with Joe Zerilli's Italian organization. The Purple Gang would cede all their rackets and gambling operations to the Mafia. In exchange for a lifetime pension funded by the Italians, Abe Bernstein lived out his remaining years in a luxury suite at the Book Cadillac Hotel in downtown Detroit, now the Westin Book Cadillac, a beautiful historic property that anyone can stay in. He died peacefully on March 7, 1968, at approximately 76 years of age. He was paid monthly for the rest of his life by the organization that had superseded his. There is something almost admirable about it. He saw what was coming. He negotiated from whatever position remained to him, and he spent his final years in comfort. A spectator to the Mafia era, his organization had, in some ways, made possible. The Purple Gang's legacy in Detroit is complicated. They were violent, they were ruthless. They killed people, but they were also, in their own strange way, a success story of a particular kind of immigrant American ambition, young men from poverty who saw what the world around them was willing to reward and pursued it with everything they had. The history of Detroit cannot be told without them, and the history of the partnership cannot be told without understanding that it rose, in part, in the space the Purple Gang left behind. There are things about the Detroit partnership that will never be fully known. Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found. His murder, despite being one of the most investigated crimes in American history, has never produced a criminal conviction. The men who did it, or ordered it, are almost certainly all dead now. Whatever they knew went with them. The full extent of the partnership's heroin distribution network, built through its connections to the Sicilian Mafia in the post-war period, was never entirely mapped by law enforcement. The scale of the operation, the routes it used, the organizations it supplied, these remain only partially documented. The partnership's political connections, the relationships it maintained with local politicians, law enforcement officials, and public figures over nearly a century are documented in places through federal investigations. But the full picture of who was paid, who looked the other way, and what arrangements were made in the shadows remains incomplete. And perhaps most haunting, the scope of the marriage edict's effectiveness. How many families in the Detroit metropolitan area, families that consider themselves entirely legitimate, entirely respectable, entirely separate from any criminal history, carry in their bloodlines the DNA of the Detroit partnership, without knowing it or having any connection to its criminal activities? The intermarriage requirement created connections that radiated outward for generations. Some of those descendants know, some do not. Some carry the name and the face, and none of the knowledge. Criminal organizations are not supposed to have legacies. They are supposed to be cases, indictments, convictions, statistics in FBI annual reports. But the Detroit partnership was something more than that. It was, by any dispassionate analysis, one of the most successful organizational enterprises in Michigan history. It survived Prohibition and its repeal. It survived the Depression. It survived World War II. It survived the Kefauver hearings, the Appalachian disaster, the McClellan Committee, the RICO Act, the crack epidemic, the decline of the auto industry, the demographic collapse of the city it operated in, and nearly a century of federal investigation It operated at a profit for most of that time. It maintained internal discipline that most legitimate corporations would envy. It adapted to changing environments. It weathered the loss of key personnel. It institutionalized succession, planning through the intermarriage requirement in a way that ensured continuity across generations. Scott Bernstein, one of the most knowledgeable writers on Detroit, organized crime, called the Detroit family a picture of success. Stability, functionality, and diversification. He was not wrong. But success at what? Stability in service of what? Functionality toward what end? The answer is the extraction of money and power from the lives of ordinary people, through gambling debts, through loan shark interest, through union corruption that meant workers' retirement funds built Las Vegas casinos instead of funding retirements, through the drug distribution networks that put heroin into communities that were already struggling, through the corruption of public officials that made it harder for honest businesses and honest citizens to trust the institutions that were supposed to protect them. The partnership was effective at all of this. And every dollar it extracted, every institution it corrupted, every person it compromised, these were real costs borne by real people who never appeared in the trial transcripts. The glamour of the story, and there is glamour, there is no point pretending otherwise, sits on top of an enormous weight of harm. As of the time of this story's telling, the question of whether the Detroit partnership still exists in any functional sense is genuinely contested. Law enforcement in Michigan maintained, as late as the 2010s, that the organization remained operational, diminished but alive. The names and faces had changed, but the basic machinery, bookmaking, loan sharking, the enforcement of debts through the implicit threat of violence, had not entirely disappeared. The FBI's Detroit field office continued monitoring figures associated with the organization. The Jackie Giacalone generation, the sons and nephews of the men who built the Golden Age, represented either the last gasp of the partnership or the foundation of something new. Detroit itself was changing again. The city that had gone bankrupt in 2013 began a slow and contentious recovery through the 2010s. Downtown was revitalized. Certain neighborhoods saw investment. The auto industry stabilized, then recovered, then faced new disruptions as electric vehicles and autonomous driving technology rewrote the assumptions of the business. Whether the partnership would find ways to embed itself in this new Detroit, or whether the organization had finally reached the end of its remarkable run, was a question that remained unanswered. Law enforcement sources in Michigan have continued to monitor a small but active network of individuals with historical ties to the old partnership. While the golden era of powerful bosses and massive rackets is clearly over, elements of the old gambling and loan sharking operations still appear in occasional federal cases. The organization didn't end with a bang, like so much of Detroit's history. It simply evolved, faded into the background, and became part of the city's quiet undercurrent. Criminal organizations, like all organisms, adapt or die. The Detroit partnership had adapted for 90 years. The next adaptation, if it happened, would be invisible by design. Because that had always been the point, we have traveled a long way tonight. From the river to the parking lot, from Sicily to Grosse Pointe, from whiskey barrels to pension funds. But before we reach the end, I want to sit with something that the story of the Detroit partnership makes impossible to ignore. What was it that made this organization different? Most American Mafia families of the 20th century burned bright and collapsed spectacularly. The New York families, the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Luccheses, the Bonanos, the Colombos, generated mountains of headlines, produced famous trials, and were ultimately torn apart by the combination of RICO prosecutions, FBI infiltration, and a cascade of cooperating witnesses who chose reduced sentences over loyalty. Chicago's outfit had similar vulnerabilities. Kansas City, Cleveland, Philadelphia, one by one. The great American crime families of the mid-20th century were dismantled through the aggressive federal prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s. Detroit survived longer, suffered less. The reasons are multiple, and they interlock. The intermarriage requirement. We have discussed this, but it deserves emphasis. In a world where criminal organizations were being torn apart by informants, by men who had no deeper loyalty than self-preservation, the partnership had built a structure where betrayal meant destroying your own family. The personal cost of cooperation was simply higher than it was for men in other organizations, the restraint on violence. The partnership's policy of using violence only as an absolute last resort meant that it generated fewer bodies, fewer investigations, fewer witnesses, fewer loose ends. Violence drew attention. Attention brought law enforcement. Law enforcement found things. The partnership minimized all of this by minimizing violence. The policy of silence and secrecy at all times. Joe Zerilli set the tone. He almost never appeared in public in any role that acknowledged his criminal status. He ran legitimate businesses. He attended mass. He lived in a nice house in a wealthy suburb. He did not give interviews. He did not threaten people in public. He did not wave guns around. He moved through the world like a successful businessman, which in many respects he was. The policy of maintaining distance from day-to-day operations. A boss who never personally gave an order that could be overheard, who communicated through intermediaries, who maintained plausible deniability at every level, was extraordinarily difficult to convict. This was the genius of the arrangement, and it was also why so many of the partnership's federal prosecutions were so difficult to mount. And finally, Detroit itself. Detroit was not New York. It was not a city where the mob's presence was a constant feature of public conversation, where journalists obsessively covered organized crime, where trials drew national audiences to packed courtrooms. Detroit's mob was a quieter presence in a city that had other things to worry about: automotive cycles, racial tension, economic collapse. The partnership operated in something closer to obscurity than any New York family could have managed. Obscurity was always the plan. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Detroit partnership story is its relationship to the National Commission. The commission that Lucky Luciano created in 1931, that governing body that Detroit joined in 1956, was effectively dismantled by the 1986 commission trial in New York, which convicted the bosses of all 5 New York families on RICO charges. The conviction of Gambino boss Paul Castellano, Genovese boss Anthony Salerno, Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo, Colombo boss Carmine Persico, and Bonanno boss Philip Rostelli ended the commission as an active institutional force. But the relationships that the commission represented, the mutual recognition of territorial boundaries, the framework for resolving disputes, did not disappear entirely with the convictions. They simply became less formal, less structured, less powerful. Detroit's position in this post-commission world was ambiguous. The organization had always been more autonomous than its New York peers, more self-contained, less dependent on the broader national framework. The commission's collapse changed the landscape, but did not eliminate the partnership's ability to function. What did change was the broader context. A national mafia that had functioned as an interconnected system, with families coordinating on everything from Las Vegas, casino operations to labor racketeering to drug distribution, was now fragmented. Each surviving family was more on its own. For the Detroit partnership, this isolation was manageable. It had always operated with a degree of independence. For other families, it was fatal. One thread of the Detroit partnership story that deserves more attention than it usually receives is its relationship to the Sicilian Mafia. The connection predated the partnership itself. It went back to Terracini, the village in Sicily where Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco were born, where their families had roots, where the Mafia's presence in Sicilian life was simply a fact of existence. No different from the church or the local government after World War II. The Sicilian Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, re-emerged as a powerful force in Sicily. Having survived both Mussolini's anti-mafia campaigns and the chaos of the war itself, it rebuilt its networks. It found new revenue streams. And one of the most important was heroin. Sicily, and particularly Palermo, became a central processing and distribution point for heroin moving from Turkey and the Middle East through Italy and into the United States. This became known as the French Connection, though French referred to the role of Corsican chemists in processing the morphine base into heroin, not to any French criminal organization. Detroit's partnership with the Sicilian Cosa Nostra gave it early access to this supply chain. The shared Terracini origins of the partnership's founders meant that the personal relationships of trust, the ones that made such business possible, already existed. Zerilli knew people, Tocco knew people. The village connections traveled across the Atlantic and remained functional for decades. This heroin connection made the partnership a major player in North American drug distribution from the late 1940s onward, a role that was not always publicly acknowledged but was well understood within law enforcement and within the organization itself. The money from heroin was extraordinary, and it was, in some ways, even less traceable than gambling income, because the supply chain was entirely separate from Detroit's domestic operations. It connected to different networks, ran through different channels, and generated money that could be integrated into the organization's legitimate businesses with minimal direct exposure. Jack Tocco accumulated an impressive real estate portfolio over his years at the helm of the partnership. He and his brother Tony developed properties throughout the Oakland Township area. The 32-acre Royal View Estates project generated millions in profit. Hazel Park Raceway, real estate, construction. Restaurants, these were not facades. They were functional businesses that generated real revenue that happened to be enhanced by and intermingled with criminal proceeds. This was the partnership's master strategy. Perfected over decades, legitimate business was not just cover. It was an actual business. The returns from crime subsidized the expansion of legitimate holdings. The legitimate holdings provided both income and respectability. The two worlds were so thoroughly integrated that separating them was, even for federal investigators with RICO authority, extraordinarily difficult. When Jack Tocco was sentenced in 1998, he was supported by former Tigers manager Sparky Henderson, former politicians, lawyers, and priests. These men were not mob associates. They were simply people who knew Jack Tocco as a businessman, as a community figure, as someone who had been a visible and apparently respectable presence in Michigan for decades. This was the longest con the partnership ever ran. Not the gambling operations, not the Las Vegas skimming, not the Teamsters pension fund. The longest con was the presentation of itself to the legitimate world as something that belonged there. For most of a century, it worked in the history of the Detroit partnership, as in the history of all powerful institutions. There are the men who appear in the records, and the men who do not. The men in the records, Zerilli, Tocco, Giacalone, Melli, Licavoli, Preziola, are the ones this story has followed. They are the ones that federal investigations named, that congressional committees called to testify, that newspapers covered when they could. But behind them and around them were hundreds of other men. Men who ran local gambling operations in specific neighborhoods. Men who collected loan shark payments from small businesses. Men who moved money from one account to another through networks of shell companies and front businesses. Men who worked in restaurants or construction companies that were partnership affiliated, who participated in the criminal enterprise, without ever rising to a level where their names appeared in federal indictments. These men had families. They had children who went to school and grew up and chose their own paths. Some of those children joined the family business. Many did not. Many became teachers, doctors, auto workers, nurses, lawyers, entirely legitimate citizens who happened to have complicated fathers or uncles or grandfathers. The human reality of organized crime is not just the men in the newspapers. It is the entire ecosystem of families, relationships, communities, and lives that forms around an organization that endures for generations. Detroit has always known this, even when it didn't say it out loud. Detroit is more than the setting for this story. It is, in some ways, the story. The city that Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco came to in 1910 was a city of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary inequality. The industrial boom that Henry Ford was generating created enormous wealth, but the men who generated that wealth by working in the factories received a small fraction of it, while the men who owned the factories received the rest. This inequality was the soil in which organized crime grew. Not because poverty inevitably produces crime, it doesn't, not automatically, but because communities that feel excluded from legitimate pathways to prosperity, that distrust the institutions that are supposed to serve them, that face barriers of language and discrimination and cultural distance, those communities are more vulnerable to the alternative structures that organized crime provides. The Sicilian immigrants who built the Detroit Partnership came from a world where the Mafia had functioned for centuries as an alternative government, one that provided dispute resolution, protection, and economic opportunity outside the legitimate state structures that had always failed them. They brought that model to America, not because they were inherently criminal, but because they understood, from generations of experience, how the world actually worked when official institutions couldn't be trusted. This doesn't excuse what they did. The harm was real. The people they preyed upon, the workers whose pension funds were stolen, the gamblers whose debts were enforced through violence, the communities saturated with heroin, the political systems corrupted by mob money, were real people who paid real costs. But understanding the origins of the institution helps explain why it was so durable. The Detroit Partnership did not persist for nearly a century through brutality alone. It persisted because it filled certain functions that nothing else filled. It created employment and economic opportunity for men who had few other options. It provided a form of stability and predictability, even if a criminal one, in communities that otherwise had little of either. It generated money that circulated through Italian-American Detroit in ways that supported families and businesses. This is the uncomfortable truth about organized crime. It is not simply predatory. It is also, in certain ways, embedded. It gives certain people certain things they want or need, and it extracts payment, sometimes enormous payment, for providing them. The Detroit Partnership understood this. Joe Zerilli understood it. His entire approach to running the organization was informed by a desire to keep it embedded, enough that the communities it operated in would not actively move against it. In this, as in so much else, he succeeded. The children of the men who built and ran the Detroit Partnership faced a choice that no one explicitly articulated, but everyone understood. The sons who joined, Tony Zerilli, Jack Tocco, the Giacalone brothers, the Tocco cousins of the next generation, made a choice, in some sense, even if it was a choice shaped by everything they had been born into. They chose the world their fathers had built. But there were also sons who did not choose it, daughters who went to college and moved away and built lives that had no connection to the organization their fathers or grandfathers had served, children who carried the name without carrying the weight of what the name meant in certain rooms. These people, the ones who got out, who simply lived ordinary lives, are as much a part of the story as the ones who stayed. Because the measure of the partnership's long shadow is not only in the men who died in federal prison or the women who stood beside them in courtrooms. It's also in the grandchildren who carry genes from both worlds and may not know it. Living in Michigan suburbs, working in offices and hospitals and schools, as far from the Detroit River's old smuggling routes as the moon. Harris Machus, who opened the Red Fox restaurant in 1965, was not a happy man in the years after 1975. He had built a fine dining establishment. He had earned awards for his kitchen. His restaurant was one of the best in suburban Detroit, frequented by wealthy businessmen and their families, a place associated with occasion and celebration and the good things in life. And then Jimmy Hoffa climbed into a car in his parking lot, and nobody could think of the Machus Red Fox as anything other than the place where Hoffa disappeared. Machus died in 2001 at the age of 92. He never reconciled himself to what his restaurant's parking lot had become, a historical landmark of the worst kind, visited by journalists and crime writers and curious tourists who wanted to stand in the place where one of the great mysteries of American history had begun. The restaurant eventually closed. The building was razed. In its place stands an Andiamo's, a successful Italian restaurant chain with multiple Detroit area locations. It is a pleasant restaurant. People eat there without necessarily knowing what stood there before, what happened there, whose last phone call was made from the edge of that parking lot. History has a way of covering itself. One of the most remarkable facts about the Detroit Partnership is not any specific crime or any specific conviction. It is the silence across nearly a century of organized crime, through dozens of federal investigations, through congressional hearings and RICO trials and the collapse of mafia families across the country. The Detroit Partnership produced exactly one member who testified against the organization in open court. One in 7 decades, in an era when the American Mafia was being dismantled wholesale by men who chose their own survival over their omerta. The Detroit Partnership held. The intermarriage edict explains part of this, but not all of it. Culture explains the rest. A culture built carefully, maintained deliberately, transmitted across generations. A culture in which silence was not just a legal protection, but an identity, a way of being in the world, something passed from father to son, not through explicit instruction, but through example, through the daily practice of what was said and what was not said, of who was trusted and who was not, of how business was conducted and how it was discussed, or rather, how it was never discussed in a world full of noise, in a city that spent the 20th century roaring with industrial sound and cultural energy, and then going terribly quiet in its collapse. The Detroit Partnership maintained its silence as others maintained their dignity. It was their greatest achievement. It was also their most complete crime. In the final years of the Commission's active existence, before the 1986 trial dismantled it, there was a general recognition among the national mafia leadership that the Detroit Partnership was something special. It was not the largest family. New York's 5 families dwarfed it in membership. Chicago's outfit was in some respects more powerful at its peak. But Detroit was admired, if that is the right word for one criminal organization's regard for another, for its stability, its discipline, its longevity, and its profitability. Joe Zerilli sat on the commission from 1956 until his death in 1977. That is 21 years. 21 years of attending, or being represented at, the governing body of American organized crime. 21 years of having a voice in decisions that affected criminal enterprises from New York to Las Vegas. He used that voice carefully. He did not overreach. He did not acquire enemies unnecessarily. He maintained the reputation of a man whose word was good, whose organization was reliable, and whose counsel was worth having. When other bosses were going to prison, or being shot in restaurant doorways, or running from the law in expensive suits through Upstate New York mud. Joe Zerilli was sitting in his house in Grosse Pointe, tending his garden, attending church, and waiting. He always waited. He had the patience of a man who understood that in the long game, patience was the supreme weapon. Stand on the bank of the Detroit River today. The river is still there. It is still half a mile wide at its narrowest point. Windsor, Ontario, still sits on the other side, close enough that on a clear day you can see cars moving on its streets. The Ambassador Bridge, built in 1929, during the very height of Prohibition and the rum-running era, still connects the two cities above the water. The Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, completed in 1930, connects them below. In the early 1920s, boats crossed this river every night, loaded with Canadian whiskey. Men drove cars across its frozen surface in winter, feeling the ice flecks beneath them, listening for the creak that meant they'd gone too far. The Purple Gang waited on the American shore with guns. The Italian organization was building the networks that would last 100 years. None of that is visible from the riverbank today. What you can see is water, dark water in winter, catching the light of both cities, the reflection of two nations looking at each other across this narrow strip of cold river. The river doesn't remember, or maybe it does, in the way that water remembers everything that has moved through it, carrying the memory forward, but never saying it aloud. Just moving, always moving, from somewhere upstream to somewhere downstream, keeping everything it knows in the silence of its current. The Detroit Partnership was a river in that sense. It rose in one place and time. It flowed through decades, past obstacles that would have stopped anything less determined, absorbing tributaries of new money and new men, flowing around the rocks of federal investigations, always finding the path of least resistance, always moving. Did it stop? Not entirely, not clearly, not in any way that you could point to and say, there, that is where it ended. Rivers don't end. They disperse, they spread, they sink into the ground and become something else. They reach the sea and lose their specific identity while contributing their water to the larger body. From 1910 to the present, more than a century. That is how long the story of the Detroit Partnership spans. From the arrival of two young men from Terracini on a Detroit that was roaring with industrial noise and ambition, to the quiet persistence of an organization that, diminished and ghost-like, may still be out there somewhere in the shadows of a city that has learned to survive its own collapse. What is the measure of that century? The money extracted from ordinary people through gambling debts, billions of dollars in total over the decades. The pension funds looted, the retirement savings of truck drivers redirected into Las Vegas casinos, where mobsters skimmed cash in paper bags, the drugs distributed, the heroin that moved through Detroit's networks and into communities across North America, purchasing its share of addiction and death, the corruption maintained, the politicians paid, the police officers bribed, the judges influenced, the institutions corroded from inside by the steady application of money and fear. And against all of that, the discipline, the silence, the family loyalty that, for all its criminal application, was in some ways genuine, the community the organization embedded itself in, the weddings and baptisms and funerals that it attended, the businesses it patronized, the charities it supported, the ordinary life it lived alongside its criminal one. This is not a celebration. It is a reckoning. The partnership built something. What it built caused enormous harm, and it lasted long enough and maintained enough discipline that it never fully answered for everything it did. That is the story. We end where we began. Bloomfield Township, July 30th, 1975. The parking lot of the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant. A 91-degree afternoon. A maroon Mercury Marquis. Jimmy Hoffa is standing beside a payphone. He has just told his wife he doesn't know where the people he was supposed to meet are. He says he'll be home by 4. He hangs up. He walks back toward the lot. A car arrives. He knows the name that car belongs to. He trusts it. Or maybe he trusted it once, and his trust came too late. Or he was too committed to the meeting to walk away from it. Or he genuinely believed that nothing would happen to him, because he was Jimmy Hoffa, and he had always been able to handle whatever came at him. He gets in, the door closes, the car drives away, and in the silence that settles over that parking lot, over the asphalt shimmering in the Michigan summer heat, over the 1974 Pontiac sitting abandoned, over the whole blazing ordinary afternoon, in that silence, you can hear the full weight of everything this story has carried. The river, the whiskey, the men from Terracini, the Purple Gang's violence and its implosion, the ruling council and their houses in Grosse Pointe, the Teamsters and the pension fund, and Las Vegas and the casino skim, the intermarriage edict and the code of silence, and the one man, in 70 years, who finally broke it. The indictments, the convictions, the sentences too light, the sentences served, the men who came home and resumed their positions, the city's collapse, the city's stubborn attempt at resurrection, and through all of it, through the entire century, that silence, the Detroit Partnership's most perfect, most terrible, most enduring achievement, it is still out there, somewhere quiet as the river, moving from a frozen river in the winter of 1920, where men drove whiskey across the ice and listened for the sound of it cracking beneath them, to an empty parking lot in the summer of 1975, where a man stood beside a payphone and made his last call home, to a federal courtroom in 1998, where a boss who had outlasted everything sat quietly while a parade of charges was read against him. The Detroit Partnership built an empire on silence, and silence, in the end, was the only thing that outlasted them. In the end, the partnership didn't die with a dramatic shootout or a sweeping RICO conviction that made national headlines. It faded quietly, the way it had always operated, becoming part of the background noise of Detroit life, invisible to those who weren't looking carefully. Some of its influence may still linger in quiet corners of the city's gambling and labor worlds, carried on by younger men who learned the old ways from uncles and grandfathers. But the golden age, the era when a handful of men from a small Sicilian village could quietly control a major American city, is gone. What remains is a ghost story told in parking lots, riverbanks, and old neighborhoods, a reminder of how power can hide in plain sight, and how silence can sometimes be the most effective weapon of all. If you made it here to the very end of this story, then thank you. You spent hours with me tonight, in Detroit, in another century, in the dark. You followed the river and the whiskey and the blood and the money and the code. You stayed. If this story moved you, if it kept you up when you should have been asleep, if it made you think, if it made you want to know more, then please leave a like on this video. It takes 2 seconds. And for a channel like this, it means everything. Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already being built, and you don't want to miss where it begins. Drop a comment. Tell me your favorite part of tonight's story. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you already knew. Tell me what you're going to think about when you finally close your eyes. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? What time is it there? Are you in bed with the lights off, the phone close to your face, the world outside your window quiet? Because there are people all over the world listening to this story right now, all of them in the dark, all of them quiet, all of them connected by a story about silence and loyalty and a city and a river and men who came from a small village in Sicily and built something that lasted nearly 100 years. That's something. Sleep well tonight, stay safe, and I will see you in the next story.